Welcome to the Hollywood Scholar. I'm Jed Morgan, and I just finished House of the Dragon, King of the Narrow Sea. And this episode, I have a couple minor issues with that bring it down from the mastery of episode 3, or at least the mastery by current day standards of episode 3, but it is still above the first two episodes in a lot of ways. I still very much enjoyed this episode despite my minor issues with it, and still consider it decent television. And by today's standards, it's great television, especially when compared to its immediate competitor, Rings of Power. And a lot of my issues mainly stick in the realm of cliches. The show uses cliches in very masterful ways, but it still uses them. So that's a bit of a conflicted point for me. So some of my criticism will be oriented around cliches, and some of the intrigue was very thought out and thought-provoking for part of it, and not so much in others. So a lot of my criticism is very conflicted, with some good and some bad mixed into the things that I am criticizing. Overall, though, I did very much like this episode, and I'm very much looking forward to the rest of the season, and I'm very much invested after episode 3 and the masterful writing that was included in that. And just like episode 3, the best part of this episode was its willingness to trust the audience. It left subtlety in the visuals in such a way that you were able to try to figure out what was going on. Several things carried over some subtlety of the previous episodes and just let the audience figure it out. And that's something that is so rare in Hollywood that I need to give it praise. It doesn't go crazy over the top or is in no way profound, but it does it in such a way that I feel like I'm invested. I'm involved in the story because I'm figuring it out just as much as the characters themselves are. And that should just be a basic thing in Hollywood these days, but it's so rare that it feels like I need to highlight it here at the beginning. But I will be getting into minor spoilers, so spoiler alert. One of my favorite things was actually the very beginning of the episode, and that might be partially because of bias. I really enjoyed the suitor interaction with the Rhaenyra and the suitors when I think she was down in Dragonstone. I'm not 100% sure where she was at, but she was a ways away from the King's Landing and the Keep. So I don't know where she was at, but the suitor sequence was very interesting, starting out with an old man to a young child all asking for a hand, and it very much reminded me of the Odyssey at the end of it when Penelope is getting her suitors and Odysseus has to come in and clean them out so that he can win his wife's hand back. And that is a biasy on my point. The Odyssey is my favorite novel to exist, so seeing that connection I very much enjoyed, and we got a little bit of a peek into Rhaenyra's mindset and, you know, what her priorities were in that sequence. It was nothing profound by any stretch of the imagination, but did bear mentioning because I really enjoyed it, and since it was the first scene of the episode, it really drew me in and got me connected to the characters and the plotline that was going on, and I was just really intrigued with the episode already from the very opening moments. And just like the previous episodes, this one lets you figure out where it is in the timeline, how much time has passed between the previous episode. Eventually it does tell us, but by that point, there are little clues like Alicent is no longer pregnant, Viserys' hairline is moved back. There's a lot of subtle things. The haircut of Matt Smith, which is a criticism I have. I don't like the short haircut. I guess it's not technically a criticism. I just prefer the long hair. That might be just me. But there are little things that it lets you do before Matt Smith's character, Damon, eventually says that it has been 4 years since he left, making it 1 year after the previous episode. And later on, they do also say that Aegon, the new child of King Viserys, is 3 years old now, and it was his second birthday in the previous episode. So they do eventually tell us, but there's subtlety beforehand that you can figure it out, and even when they do tell us, it's nowhere near the Rings of Power where it's obsessively repeating it over and over to make sure the audience gets it, as if those writers believe the audience is not capable of figuring it out on their own. House of the Dragon has a very good balance between those two extremes of trusting the audience and letting them figure it out, that it should just be normal. This should just be average at the very best, these basic things that it's doing, but they need to be highlighted in today's current crap of inadequate writing. And furthermore, continuing on that, I really loved the dialogue throughout most of this episode. A lot of great stuff, and one of my favorite lines was actually in a different language, and so I had to turn on the subtitles. Really covered it, but I really liked Damon's line to Rhaenyra, talking about how her mother Emma had died and how she felt about that and whatnot. And Damon comes back with, "You cannot live in fear, or you will forsake the best parts of it." It's a very simple line, and with a little bit of grammar change, it would be a little bit better. But I quite enjoyed the sentimentality behind it and the thought behind it that really spoke to both Damon's character and Rhaenyra by her response to it. And it was just really well written. And kind of going back to the audience, trusting the audience to figure it out, another one of my favorite sequences is when Rhaenyra escapes from the palace, from the keep, because the previous episodes have really set her up as someone who hasn't really attuned to the life of the royal, who really wish she was common born. In a lot of situations, like her conversation with Sir Christian Cole about like, hey, you have freedom in your life, I don't, I'm very jealous. And so the moment that she got that sack of peasant clothes and instructions on how to escape her room, we didn't need her to say, oh, Damon is telling me I can go out and pretend to be a peasant and have free will for once. No, it was just all there for you to figure out. And I really appreciated that it's just like, hey, we understand what she's thinking. It didn't say, hey, this letter is from Damon. We were able to figure that out. He was the obvious choice before we eventually met up with Damon with Rhaenyra. And I really very much enjoyed how they just let you figure it out with all the clues that they had left in the previous 3 episodes. And it's just, again, so basic, yet so foreign in current day Hollywood. And the palace escape scene, I don't know why she'd never figured out that easy door was there. So that's a bit of a criticism, is how there's just this easy escape hatch from her room that she never found out about. I mean, if you'd ever pressed against the wall for one reason or another, that seemed a little bit implausible, but the writing of her motivations and the approach to why she wanted to leave was so good that it's not necessarily a deal breaker for me in that scene. And that entire sequence when they sneak into town and whatnot is a bit of a cliche. That's a very common scene when it comes to a royalty member, prince, princess, anything, or royalty member wanting to reconnect with the subjects in the kingdom and sneaking out. That's a very, very common trope that dates all the way back to Henry V, actually, when Henry V disguised himself and wanted to hear what his soldiers thought of him. And it is a tad overused. I really do like how they use it in this episode, but it is an overused trope that I feel a little bit conflicted on whether or not it was necessary. Essentially, I do like what they did with the trope, but it is still a cliche trope nonetheless. And when they got into the village, I really like the interactions between Daemon and Rhaenyra. They've had chemistry ever since the first episode, and being Targaryens, we knew that there was always a possibility that they might have some sort of relationship with each other, as that's very much expected from their family and their house. So it carried on into this episode in a very natural way, and the actors have quite a bit of chemistry with themselves in and of themselves. So it made sense. If you kind of just trying to forget about the incest aspect of it, you can kind of understand where at least they're coming from and why they're making the decisions they're making. And I think one of the most important parts of the episode, specifically for Rhaenyra's character, came in the form of that play that she went to, which it felt very much natural for the time. And making fun of royalty is always something that's important in an era like that. You can see that throughout history. The jesters are one of the most important pieces for the subjects to feel as if they're in control, to feel like it's not a tyranny if they're able to express themselves in that way. And then they did the little subtle thing of having the men playing the female parts, as in Shakespeare's day. I really appreciated a lot of the subtlety that was in some really bombastic and over-the-top lines. And I'm sure they were trying to go for a feminist message like they talked about in the end behind the scenes of the episode, which they need to really stop. Those ruin it every single time, and this episode specifically did that to quite a degree, especially when the director of this episode was talking about the sex scenes of this episode. But regardless of all that, I really appreciated that it didn't come across as feminist, even though that was their intention, because like there were women who were saying that she was a weak ruler, that was just the perception that the general people of King's Landing had of her. And that's something that isn't necessarily their fault. When you've cut yourself off from a city to such a degree that you're just in a keep and you just are known by name and no one really knows you, anything can happen to your reputation. There's nothing for them to really base their opinion off of, so rumors will abound. So it makes perfect sense why they think she's weak. And men and women were like, everyone was just saying she was weak, and that I don't think really had a whole lot to do with her gender, even though they want you to believe that, because there were a ton of women in the audience who were just like, yeah, she's weak. That's just the general perception they've got of her, and I thought that was a very important thing for Rhaenyra's character. Just like in so many other things, whenever she's like, oh, this is just because I'm a woman, this is just because of that. Christian Cole shut her down in the previous episode, saying she has a very privileged life, and there was a few sequences like that in this episode with Daemon and his response to her trying to like heckle the audience and whatnot. He had some really good responses about, hey, jest if you like, but this is what they think of you, and it's going to be difficult. He was trying to teach her a lesson, and it was a very well thought out lesson that I very much appreciated and was done very well. And that led into the whole whorehouse sequence of events. And I mean, it's nudity is back in House of the Dragon. We haven't seen it in quite a while, so of course I appreciated that. And it made sense from her perspective, how this is the first time she's seen something like this, so she seems a little out of it. And it's mainly from her inexperience that it made sense, the way that they're shooting it. That's not why they said they shot the scene like that at the behind the scenes, but it came across that way because of her inexperience. And if you think of it that way, it's actually well thought out and well done. And again, it makes sense why those two are attracted to each other based on what they've established in the previous episodes, and they don't need to say anything. It's not Rings of Power where they're just like, hey, I know these two are related, but they have chemistry, they like each other anyway. No, the previous episodes all set that up. This episode just let the audience figure it out, so I have to give it praise there. And overall, I really, really enjoyed the character of Rhaenyra. This is the first episode that I think I straight out liked her. I very much was off-putted by her in the first two episodes, but she's grown on me. She's grown on me quite a bit, to the degree that I think that she's actually a good character, and I actually like her, and I was very surprised by that. This was very much her episode, as it was Patty Constantine's in the previous. She was the one who was the standout, even above Matt Smith, who had quite a bit of time, and you guys know how much I love him, but she was the real standout of this episode. And I really enjoyed her sequences, and she showed a lot more range than she has previously. I mean, with the conflicted relationship that she has with Alicent that we've seen, it's developed even since the past episode. She smiles more. We see more emotion from her than just whiny that she came across with in the first two episodes specifically. And I really like with the development with her characters going at this point, at least, because she's changed so much from the beginning, and she's incredibly likable because of that. And another point of my criticism is the intrigue. It's very balanced out. Like the intrigue of her being just in a position where her honor could come into question. I liked a lot of the intrigue around that. And, the hand spying on her and whatnot. All that intrigue was interesting, not specifically complex, but interesting nonetheless. But it wasn't enough evidence for the hand to be removed from his position. There just wasn't enough there. As the King Viserys said, is everyone has selfish interests, and that is not a standout. Any replacement for the hand is going to have a lot of the same problems that Otto did, but Otto has proved that he actually does care about the king, and he is a vastly intelligent man, so I still think he would still be the best hand of those available at this current time, and there's just not a lot of evidence to support the idea of him being replaced, and Rhaenyra just demands it for the price of her marriage. I didn't particularly like that portion of it. It came across very unintelligent, and Otto is just a very good character, a very complex character with a lot of manipulation going on, that comes across as very similar to how Varys was just dethroned as the Master of Whispers so easily in Season 8 of Game of Thrones, and it was honestly pathetic. It's like, this is the smartest manipulator around. It would be a little bit more difficult to defeat him than this, and that's a lot of the same vibe I got from Otto, not to the same degree, but a lot of similar things that I just wasn't particularly thrilled with how they were going about it. It was just way too straightforward, and Rhaenyra just figured it out implicitly, and then Viserys listened to her, and at that point, Viserys shouldn't really have been listening to her to begin with, but Otto has proved his loyalty on so many occasions that his self-interest is understandable, and Viserys should know about that, but anyone's going to have a lot of self-interest, especially in a position like Hand of the King. So it's a balancing act, and Otto's balancing is far superior in favor of the king than a lot of other alternatives, that the intrigue in that just was subpar when it came to the reasoning for him to be removed. He should not have been removed based on the characters and the just scenery that was involved in setting up that removal. So overall, that's one of my biggest concerns with the episode, was near the end when Rhaenyra just demanded that he be removed. But otherwise, Viserys was great, Otto was great, a lot of great performances, and a lot of great writing for a lot of the characters. And one of my last major criticisms is, once again, they tried to tie it into A Song of Ice and Fire, and I hate when they do that. Just make it its own story, just keep it unique. They need to be separated from Game of Thrones to such a strong degree because of how disastrous that Season 8 was. So the less connections to that main story, the better, especially when it doesn't particularly make sense for Fire and Ice, The Song of Fire and Ice, to be implicitly tied to these characters at this time, at least from what I understand about the lore and what's been presented to me. I'm not particularly a fan of how they keep trying to tie it into that. regardless of that, overall, there's some really great dialogue, some really good writing, not to the same degree as the previous episode, but I really liked how a lot of characters progressed. Rhaenyra especially, and Alicent had some very interesting scenes. Not as good as her previous episodes. I think this is one of Alicent's middle of the road episodes. Nothing profound and nothing too off-putting either. There's still a lot of potential with her character. I hope we get a lot more development, and I'm not looking forward to the major time jump coming, which sees both Alicent and Rhaenyra change actors, because I'm very much invested in these actors, in these performances, that it's going to feel awkward losing them and trying to connect with this random person. And it's even further away than we thought. I imagine that this would be the last episode that we'd see with these younger actors, but it seems like we're at least going through the next one with them as well. So for what, less than half of the season, we're supposed to just quickly connect with these other ones, and I just don't see that, especially with the actors that they've chosen to replace them. I feel like these younger versions are far superior to them. Of course, that may change later. My mind may be changed, but Alicent and Rhaenyra are so well done at this point, at least to the degree that I'm okay with them and like them, that I don't want to see them change in that aspect, at least, especially when none of the other real characters are getting the actors changed. And so it's just kind of awkward that these two random ones are getting changed, as everyone else isn't. Not a big deal. We'll have to see how that plays out when that transition is actually made. But at this point, I wish we'd stick with these two, because I'm invested in them finally, especially Rhaenyra. This is the first episode that I'm like, all right, I'm invested in her character. I care what happens to her. And she's creeping up there on that list of great characters. And every episode, I find someone else to like and connect with, and the list of characters that I think are intriguing and well-written is growing with every single edition. So that is nothing but praise for this episode and each subsequent episode of this show. I feel like it's just getting better overall. Beyond that, 3 was just so fantastic that it's hard to beat it. So I do have to rate this episode slightly below the last one. This one will be about a 6 out of 10. Not quite as high as episode 3, but still quite up there and better than the first two. And I'm very happy with the direction the House of the Dragon is going and the intrigue involved in the characters. I'm very much invested in them. And the dialogue, I can't praise the dialogue enough. There were so many great moments, and it's like, oh, that was a great line. Oh, that was a great moment. Some really impressive stuff done by so many great writers and actors. Again, those behind-the-scenes stuff need to end, and I'm so glad that Miguel Sapochnik has left the show, because a lot of his comments at the end of the behind-the-scenes are the ones that are truly the worst. Beyond the new director who directed this episode, she was particularly off-putting as well, similar to Miguel. But as always, that other showrunner has just focused on the story itself, and that's all we've ever asked for. So it seems like his involvement is what's making this on the level that it is. So I have to give him praise where praise is due. But anyway, that's all I have for today. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Anon. If you like what I do here and want to see good, compelling stories that Hollywood will no longer give you, check out my book series, Odyssey of a Phoenix, a mythological epic about philosophy, morality, and modern-day mental illness issues. Books 1, Down in Flames, and Book 2, Apocalypse Then, currently on sale. Book 3, Kill the Dark, coming soon.